Today is Thursday, 21st of June, 2007. We're at the Oberlin College Archives in Oberlin, Ohio. And one of our objectives today is to videotape some of the pages from the album set up by the McDaniels after their service in the Near East, Turkey in particular, under the auspices of the American Committee for the Relief in the Near East, the ACRNE. They served first in Derince, which was the port area where the relief ships would come in, and later in Harput, Turkey. The images that we scanned are very small. Some of them are much deteriorated, and we've improved a lot of them. But we also thought it would be a good idea to try to scan the album itself. We've not scanned all of the pictures because much of the later imagery dealt with sort of what used to be called the Grand Tour. But we have, in fact, scanned most of the ones that deal with the Harput area. Now, this is the photographic album. It's disc-bound at this point. It's made of black paper. It's labeled ACRNE 1919-1920, which stands for American Committee for Relief in the Near East. This later became the Near East Relief, which was disbanded in 1930 and still exists in the form called the Near East Foundation. The page size is 14 inches wide by 9 inches high. Now we'll turn this and we'll see the inside of the cover. There's a logo decal, or patch more accurately, of fabric. It says American NEF. This is a patch that the McDaniels must have acquired when they actually served after World War II at the Near East Foundation. The other label here, written in the hands of Laurence McDaniels, is the American Committee for Relief in the Near East, 1919 to 1923. There's a bit of an error with the 1923. It was not. They finished their service in 1920. It's labeled further Turkey, Egypt, Greece, later called the Near East Foundation. And this is, as I said, the patch that goes with this. This was the insignia for those who served. I'm going to be turning album pages here. Now, this page is of considerable interest because it shows them on the outward journey, on our way, so to speak, 1919. This is Laurence McDaniels here and his wife Frances. They were both undergraduates here at Oberlin College. This shows a group of people on the Gloucester Castle, which was a British hospital ship, which also helped transport them. The initial part of the journey was made on the Leviathan, which was a humongous ship. In fact, it was the largest ship on Earth at the time. It was originally German, called the Vaterland, and it was taken over by the Americans during the war and then was made into a troop transport ship. So from New York City in February 1919, they made their way to the Old World. Getting back to the Gloucester Castle shows a group, and I don't recognize anyone except a couple of people. Here's Dr. McDaniels here, and here is Frances. The others are presumably people on the same thing. This was one of the first voyages out. These other pictures are not labeled, but here it clearly is a picture of the New York City skyline. Not great pictures. Again, a series of small photographs. This is labeled Frances. This is yet another one labeled Frances, and yet another one Frances. So there's 3 pictures, at least, of Mrs. McDaniels. The others aren't labeled as to who's who. Some additional pictures. only one of them is labeled. This one here, this is taken in Salonika, Greece. The next stop would be the Constantinople, now Istanbul, Turkey. Here's some views of Salonika. The Greeks call it Saloniki. There's a lot of relief work going on there too. People were destitute, refugees, displaced people. Here's a procession of Greek Orthodox priests. The others remain unlabeled. Here's yet another page, and the Bosphorus is shown here in an interesting shot. You can see the Bosphorus, Constantinople, a lot of ships there. This entire area had apparently been mined heavily, and they had to spend a lot of effort demining it. Minesweepers were, in fact, brought in to clean it out before ships like the Leviathan could make their way in. This is the Gloucester Castle, the British hospital ship, yet another view. I've not scanned this. I wish we had some time back. It looks like a 1200 scan would probably do a lot of good to help identify people, but we have another one of this shot, very similar to it, taken at University of California, Berkeley Archives. There are a number of people who served who have albums that have some or other of these kinds of pictures, so it's not a unique photograph, although interesting. Some pictures of various people. This is a particularly nice one of Mrs. McDaniel. Frances is here with a pad. She wrote a series of very interesting letters to her family back in Cincinnati, and they are copied and exist here in the Oberlin College archives. Some of these are not labeled, but one can guess at who they are because of other pictures that'll come up. This here is a picture of the Goeben. The Goeben or Goeben was renamed with a Turkish name. This was a ship that originally was going to be part of the fleet that the Germans had promised the Turks, and it figured fairly importantly in the thing, but it's not a very good picture of it, and in fact it's not even mounted, but it says German cruiser Goeben in Sea of Marmara. This ship was important during the war, World War I. So we'll just stick that there. These are some pictures here that are not real pictures in the sense that they're not photographs or photographic prints. They belong to a series of postcards that I have seen produced by the Near East Relief. Postcard stock, as it was called, was commonly used paper on which prints were made. These referred to loading flour for Romania. And here, this is a hamal, so-called laborer, who carried huge loads on their backs, carrying 400 pounds. And that was considered an average load. It wasn't even a... And of course, they didn't have the techniques that we have now. There's no such thing as containerized shipping at that time. Everything had to be moved manually, on board, off board, loading, unloading. So it was a real task. This is an interesting picture showing the Italian Army of Occupation disembarking, and having spoken briefly about loading and unloading, here's a horse in some kind of a gadget where he's being loaded. Here's yet another one where the horse is being lowered with the support. These animals must have been pretty frightened. But in any case, it shows you the activity at the ports. Here's some additional pictures, and you can see some of these are fading, or were faded, or have been faded for a very long time. Probably the most interesting picture here is of the clinic on wheels. It was run by a physician from Boston. They had it outfitted as best they could, and they would in fact take little trips periodically into the area outside of Derringer, which was the deep water port that the Germans had set up and ended up being used by the British, and the British in turn made it available to the American Committee for Relief in the Near East. And there was a spur of the Baghdad Railroad that ran out of Derringer, and it was on that spur that they would do their short trips. Here's an interesting one where they're on the track having a little bit of fun. They're on one of these hand-pumped gadgets that enable you to go without the locomotive dragging it along. So they did have a little bit of recreation. Here's some pictures that show the more normal mode of travel, ox-driven carts or water buffalo. These are seen to be oxen. This is water buffalo in this particular case. This is a Turkish inn or khan. They were pretty miserable places, and in fact they were very commonly infested with fleas, so much so that if the weather was decent, they preferred to sleep on the roof rather than inside. And if it was cold and they had to be inside, then people like the relief workers and missionaries figured out the technique of putting the legs of the cots that they inevitably brought with them in cans of oil and so forth, sort of a trick that's still used in the tropics to keep bugs and crawly insects off the bed. This is a picture of the Turkish post showing a rather flea-bitten horse. The ribs are visible if you take a good look at it. Many of these pictures are labeled to the extent that they broke these things down into categories. TI, we think, stands for the trip in, or the Turkish interior, whereas the WT stands for the wheat trip that was taken by Laurence McDaniels in search of wheat once they had gotten into Harput later on. So there is no specific order to the album. Things seem to have been mixed up a little bit, but there's a fair amount of order. I shouldn't say there's no order, it's just that it's not scientifically pulled together. There's photographs of various people, some of whom are labeled, and this is a picture of the Serbian Guard, for instance, which would have been derived much earlier. Turkish women at the depot in Izmit. Izmit was a small town. It wasn't that small, actually. It was a fairly large town with a very large Armenian population, fairly prosperous, and most of the people in that town suffered terrifically. By having wealth, I suppose it put them at particular risk. This is an American tractor at work. These are labeled as Arabs. A carpenter crew, etc. So there's another picture of the Goeben. These appear to be some of the warehouses at Derringer, that deep sea port. And they took over these warehouses and outfitted them. And in fact, it was one of the big tasks of Dr. McDaniels to organize the storage of these, the temporary storage, prior to having stuff shipped out into the more remote points and interior. So they had to have a very carefully inventoried assemblage of things, ranging from tractors all the way down to canned milk. Some of these are, this is a ship called the Newport News. On its arrival, the Newport News being unloaded, the dry docks. So there's a fair amount of information here if one wants to glean it on the daily operation. They stayed in Derringer much longer than they wanted to or had intended to, and they really got itchy feet because they wanted to go out and do some work with people rather than keeping inventory and stock and so on. But they did their best to make it a homey environment. Here's a nice picture in one of the boxcars, labeled Knox, Miss Henry, and McDaniels. This is a picture that I like particularly, going into the interior of Anatolia from Ulukishla, one of the stop-off points of the Baghdad Railroad. You can see the Baghdad. This was the Baghdad portion that was so important to Germany. They wanted access to all of the countryside along the track, all the way from Berlin to Baghdad. People are labeled here, in part. One of the people that I'm particularly interested in is Dr. Parmalee, whose papers Gene and I have looked at the Stanford Institution. Well, I should say the Hoover Institution at Stanford. There's Mrs. McDaniels there. This is the Berlin-Baghdad special. You can see that by today's standards, it's a pretty flimsy thing. But this is an interior, one of the meals taken inside the cart. A few more. Okay, now here are some additional pictures taken from the trade. You can see how they gained access to the boxcar, which were outfitted with cots, living quarters, little ladders at a stop here. Some much faded pictures of life inside the cars. Here's an interesting little aside where one of the relief workers, you can see where he's got his ACRNE hat, feeding the dogs. Of course, the dogs were as hungry as the people during this period of great destitution and difficulty in Asia Minor. Various and sundry scenes. Some of these are better labeled on the negatives, and to that extent information can be gotten and has been gained where possible. Not, if it's not labeled here, we've looked at the negatives, some of which are in existence, and a few exist for which there's no prints. But by putting it together, we've been able to do a little bit of a good job trying to get these into a more detailed mode. Otherwise, all you're doing is taking a look at things that you don't really know for sure what's what. Here are some sundry views. This here is probably the old walls of Constantinople, but one can't be sure of that. There are other cities here. This here again is the Bosporus there. This here is Angora, where there are a lot of refugees living under abysmal conditions in some of the nooks and crannies, setting up shops. There's a picture of some Kurds. The truck caravan. In the beginning, trucks were used to move relief materials in, but the roads were so horrible or non-existent that they decided that what they should do is to go back to the old technique of using mules and camels to move a lot of the goods. They just couldn't handle it otherwise because there's just too many punctures or flat tires, too many obstacles, especially as they got into the interior where things were much, much more wild. Now here's a picture here that's got a nice picture of the McDaniels taken with the small camera. some additional pictures as they're moving towards Harput now. You can see how rocky the terrain is, and in some cases rather desolate looking. There's a little boy taking a pee. When you blow this up, you can see details that otherwise might be missing. But here's some water buffalo. Water buffalo were used in some places as beasts of burden. Now here's some Turkish women. You can see them in their çarşafs. They're back to the photo. They probably would have covered themselves totally if they'd been photographed from the other dimension. But you can see these small donkeys with enormous burdens. They used to just load these things down. Amazing how much they could carry. Here's some pictures of the countryside. Here are some pictures of the trip in. I think from other work that this photograph shows the vehicles on their way around the area of Sivas or Sebastia. Gives you an idea how hilly it was and mountainous. Here's a picture of a bridge over the Euphrates River. Almost looked like a stick bridge, but again, another picture of the Turkish post. And this is a dry stream bed. See here. Now, I thought for a while that this was a scratch. It's not. Those are wires. And in fact, in that area, telegraph was in fact put in fairly early and was used as a means of communication. It was highly controlled, but nevertheless one could send wires. This is a particularly interesting picture here. On the road, it shows them stopping for lunch with the cots. Here's Dr. Parmalee, a physician who actually had been born in Turkey, spoke Armenian fluently, came from an old missionary family. She was an Oberlin undergraduate. Dr. Parmalee. This is an interesting page because it's got a nice photograph showing the group on its way to Harput, labeled on the road. There's Dr. Parmalee. There's Mrs. McDaniels. This is the faithful guide, interpreter, factotum, Man Friday, Garabed Bedrosian, who later came to the United States and died at a great age in California. This is a water fountain. It shows what the water fountains were like. They really were nothing more than springs that had a formal outlet. It's an attractive picture here of Mrs. McDaniels and Garabed in the back of one of the wagons. I guess it's not a truck. It doesn't look like a very sophisticated truck, but nevertheless. Okay, now they've arrived in Harput. This shows the Euphrates College buildings, which of course had been vacated by staff, most of whom had been deported or murdered. Students had been sent away. A few were kept as workers. And the Near East Relief, or the American Committee for Relief in the Near East, its predecessor, used these buildings as a place to house orphans and to carry out the relief work in the Harput area. Now this page is of some interest because they're clearly in Harput at this point. These are the Euphrates College buildings which were used by the relief workers as a central headquarters for the region. The college, of course, had long since closed. Some of the professors murdered, others deported. Students similarly murdered, deported, exiled. This is in the lower town of Mazida, the twin city of Harput or Harpert, showing the American hospital compound and Dr. Atkinson's home behind the wall. The American hospital was more formally known as the Annie Tracy Riggs Hospital. The lower town was about 1,000 feet or more lower than the upper city, and in fact the weather conditions were much warmer, Harput being cooler, but the lower and more hilly. Here, the lower town, Mazida, or Mazra, depending how you want to pronounce it, was much more hot, flatter. This was more the commercial center. The Vali, or the governor of the vilayet, lived here. The American consulate was there. Even though it was formally called Harput Consulate, it was in fact down here. Of course, the consulate had closed in 1917. This is a different view of the hospital complex, which is attractive in the sense that it shows the walls, the inside hospital, the home of the Atkinsons. Here is the German missionary compound and hospital and school. The Germans also had left at that point, but there were some orphanages that were resuscitated and kept going in that physical structure. Here are a couple of views labeled Harput, Turkey. This one's an interesting picture also because it shows the trail going up to Harput city from the lower town. It shows the first glimpse of Harput, where the old castle dominated the skyline. This is a picture labeled from the mission windows, looking down on St. James Armenian Church, some of the other buildings, and the plain below, where there are quite a few of Armenian villages that had been destroyed and so on. But this was Harput, O-O-T, Turkey, as it's spelled here, H-A-R-P-U-T. Mazida, which we saw earlier, has been renamed Elazig, and the city of Harput no longer exists except as a few houses and tourist attraction in the form of a park at the castle. Here we have the Armenian section of Harput, which is destroyed, an equivalent picture of the Turkish section, showing that there's no destruction, of course. All of this being deliberately perpetrated by the Young Turk government. Here are some additional pictures showing a ruined church, some town views, the Armenian section of Harput again right here in ruins. The roofs were made of wood, of course, and then they were covered, but shortage of wood in the area, people would yank these timbers out, and of course the roof would cave in, and that's part of the reason for the mess. Now, here are some pictures of the receivers of the relief work, orphans. I've always liked this particular little kid, very young, spindly legs, clearly has had favus, infection of the scalp, where they used to shave all the hair and then treat it with sulfur. Little bunny rabbit hat. Rags is what this one is labeled. There's a group of young kids. You can see these pictures of much faded, and this is a page that shows some of the recipients of the relief work that was being ministered and tendered. This is a kid here on the far left. You can see his hair's been removed, shaved off. It's part of the treatment for what they called kale or favus, to shave it off and treat it with sulfur. Here in the middle section, there's another young kid that's got kerchief type thing tied on, similar to treatment for the favus, and then cover the scalp or leave it open. Different techniques to treating it, but part of the treatment usually involved taking off all the hair if it hadn't fallen out on its own. This picture on the far right is labeled Rags, and you can see it looks like a nice young fellow, but he's certainly indigent, barefooted. Again, a couple of interesting pictures. This is Maria Jacobson, who was a Danish missionary nurse who stayed there during the genocide. The little girl here in front of her, who she eventually adopted, took back to Denmark. Her daughter's alive in California. She married a dentist in Beirut. Some of the young kids with their so-called maidigs, or little mothers, they weren't their biological mothers, they just looked after these young kids. Here's Maria Jacobson again here below, and little Bessie, as she was called, Beatrice Arshaluis Dingilian was her name. Her father was on the faculty at Harput College, one of the people who was murdered. Here we have Mary Riggs from the famous Riggs family. There she is with a young baby. And it is in fact labeled neatly Mary Riggs. Again, some pictures of the people receiving aid. This is a person named Mariam, and I have always wondered if this was Mariam, later Davis, who died recently in New Mexico. Laurence H, who also recently passed away in Albuquerque, New Mexico, knew Mariam quite well. And I had asked her if she thought this might be Mariam Davis, and she said she thought not. She said she looked a little bit too small, and I suggested at that time that with poor nutrition and the difficulties of the time, it may well have stunted her growth. But in any case, this is a Mariam, or Mary. Here are some people labeled poor relief. The woman on the right, we see her as sort of being one of the employees of the relief effort, clearly an older Armenian woman tendering relief unto some pretty miserable older Armenians who have somehow survived in the area. And further down below that is the old ladies' home, where some still older women are earning their keep by spinning and weaving and making clothing and so on. They viewed themselves as being orphans as well, because they had lost their husbands or any male relatives who could help look after them. That being the case in a strongly patriarchal society like the Armenian society. You could be a half orphan and you still considered yourself an orphan if you didn't have a father. Here are some scenes dealing with the rebuilding of fountains. As we mentioned earlier, building of these fountains was carried out usually at the site of a spring, where one put a face on it and some bricks, adobe. This here is probably being reconstructed by, I'm not sure, I thought maybe some Turks, but some of them look Armenian, etc. But in any case, it's an effort to get the spring getting going again. There's some interesting shots there that we have scanned and expanded. Here's a few more scenes. This picture here below, unfortunately, shows some cute kids at the fountain, but they have, there's been an ink splotch here that has covered some of their faces. This picture here it suggests to me that this is a Kurdish woman because of the headdress. Very precisely. That kind of headdress is very characteristic of the headgear that the Kurds in that region wore. Here, it's interesting on the left where they're saying it's working at the fountain even as they take baths. So they're taking advantage of the water availability and an opportunity to have a bit of a bath at the fountain area. Here are some prints that are of interest. This picture ended up being put into the National Geographic, and Laurence McDaniels is credited with the photograph. The person on the left appears to be Garabed Bedrosian, who worked not only with the consuls when there was an active consulate in the Harput area, Mazida, but he was also a translator and worker for the American Committee for the Relief in the Near East. He served as a translator for people like the McDaniels, etc. So he was very well thought of. He came to the U.S., settled briefly in Whitensville, Massachusetts, in Worcester County, didn't like it, and ended up moving to Fresno, California, where he lived and ultimately died at a very great age. But you can see the stacks of wood, and this is the Turk owner of the wood pile. Wood was scarce in that area. It always was. There was never enough water to handle big trees. And poplar poles, here's a picture of the poplar pole market. Poplar poles were used in construction of roofs in particular. They would stack these close to and fill them in. These were largely for flat roof structures. And here is a heavy load being carried by donkeys. You can see them loaded to the hilt. But this is firewood. Here are some additional interesting scenes. I'll dispense with this one first, right at the outset, the one on the lower left. Castor Oil Factory. Well, this is a photograph that the McDaniels must have acquired while they were over there, but dating from a period that very much antedated them, because we've seen this in a collection that derived from at least 1914. It may or may not be castor oil. Castor oil was used sometimes as a lamp oil in these lamps that had wicks. It could have even been linseed, because linseed was similarly used. It wasn't as good as castor because it smoked more. This is another old picture, the upper right, of an Armenian bakery, showing the soft bread here, lavash, being baked in these ovens, which were almost like our brick oven, pizza ovens nowadays. But again, he could not have taken this picture because I've seen it from a much earlier period. On the upper left, we have a merchant khan materials being stored. Now these hotels or inns or khans, and that's a exaggeration in terms of connotation because they were really pretty seedy places. The courtyard was frequently used as a place where the pack animals like camels or donkeys would be housed, etc. And goods that were going to be moved on or to other places, sort of like a distribution depot in some cases, was housed. So that shows all this gear stuck up. Who it belongs to, we don't know. These are some fox skins hanging from what looks like a clothesline of sorts at one of the khans, I think. Let's see the string here, that thin line. And here is a second-hand shop, which is really, again, kind of a junk shop that's trying to sell something or other. Again, it may not be a real second-hand shop. It's just a pile of stuff they're either trying to get rid of or what have you. These three shots deal with market scenes. The one on the far left is labeled candles. Now, candles were quite expensive at that time. Many homes didn't use candles because they were more expensive than the oil lamps that I mentioned a little bit ago. But in any case, these are being sold for what they're worth, probably beeswax. The lower right shows the wood market with an Armenian woman, long hair. A couple of them you can identify. Some of them are either Turks or Kurds, but there are a few Armenians in there, including this young fella here. This woman here is, again, more than likely, these are Armenians. You can tell by their clothing. The clothing isn't that good a guide, but in many cases there are some peculiarities that enable one to be fairly certain as to who's wearing what. Here's some more market scenes. You can see here on the left in this image here, there's like a central little bit of a water stream trickling down. It was not uncommon to have open sewage type of thing or springs running through the town. Here's yet another scene. And this here is a cute one where the meat market, where the dogs have all assembled for a dish out. The dogs, of course, like everybody else in that whole area at that time, suffered quite a lot from lack of food and what all. Here again are two I consider very exceptional pictures. The one on the left is a cleft rock on the path to Harput. You can see this, and the Frances McDaniels is on the left. I've blown this up. You can see her here, perhaps. And then you've got Mary Riggs on a horse in the middle. And then Margaret Niles is on the far right on a horse. So the three of them. But that cleft rock you can see is pretty substantial. This here is the approach to Harput from Husenik. Husenik, she's called it Husenik. It's probably better to pronounce it Husenig with a g sound. It was a fairly affluent town, and mostly half Armenian, half Turk is probably a more accurate way of describing it. But it was a stone's throw from Harput Mazira, and the history of Husenik has been written from the perspective of an Armenian in Worcester, Martin Duranian's father, who used to teach Sunday school and so forth in Worcester, and then that's been expanded upon by his son. But the history of Husenik is fairly interesting and fairly detailed. Again, a couple of interesting pictures in particular. New Year's Day, 1920. Henry Harrison Riggs on the left-hand side, Carleton College graduate, one of the presidents of Euphrates College. Now you hear Mary Riggs, Frances McDaniels, labeled in the far lower left in whiting, Harput. And here's Frances C. McDaniels, FCM, on tripod. And I had commented that tripod certainly has 4 legs, so whatever. But they're fairly high up, looking down on the plain below. Seems to be a little bit of snow. The winters were severe in this area, and the summers were hot.
Okay.
This too is an interesting page. It's labeled Mule Caravan here in the upper right. And it shows supplies arriving at Harput. And the picture, I'm not sure which one it is, but one of these, again, has appeared in National Geographic. And it shows mules in one case, camels in another. On the far right, we see a lead mule in the camel train. The idea being that according to folklore, camels in these long caravans did not like starting off following a single camel. So a mule was traditionally used. And I actually talked to a camel expert by email some time back. And he said that it didn't make sense to him, but it could be because there's a huge amount of folklore about camels and so forth. But nevertheless, in tradition, the lead mule was the first one, and then the camels followed. The relief work during the period the McDaniels was there was mainly effected by mule or camel train. As I mentioned earlier, the roads were so horrible and the breakdowns so frequent that they really couldn't use trucks. So they decided to go back to the old tried and true technique of caravans. So we see these things arriving at the upper city of Harput, right outside the quarters where a lot of the orphanages and orphan work was being done. Now this page is labeled Arrival of the Camel Caravans. So Mrs. McDaniels in particular was enchanted with these huge camels, which are in fact not the ordinary dromedary camels. These are hybrids, first generation F1 hybrids, just like mules are F1 hybrids of horse and donkey. The camel caravans were manned by these enormous beasts, which were F1s between the one-humped dromedary and the two-humped Bactrian. And they really used to joke that they had only 1.5 humps. But they're very strong, and they could resist the colder climate that the dromedaries wouldn't be able to. But they carried huge, huge loads, and of course there was a lot of excitement when these would arrive, and sewing machines and ovens and enormous loads. And the muleteers, as the camel drivers during this period, were all Kurds. They apparently had a pretty good go of trying to communicate with these people too. They thought they were pretty good guys, though. Okay. Here's another page with the camels arriving. Some of them are kind of faded at this point, but nevertheless the scans show very clearly the huge burdens that they've got. You see these massive boxes on either side. There's one kneeling here. See how fuzzy and furry these animals are. They're cold coins. And of course, these camel caravans had to come in from the coast, because these shipments would be made by boat to the port in Samsun.
Great. Okay.
This page shows the camel caravan being unloaded. The pictures are unfortunately much faded, but they're okay on the scans. You can see the huge box loads. Camel there kneeling. See from this kind of picture here that very hairy, fuzzy animals, very strong as mentioned. These caravans would come in from the coast by boat all the way to the port of Samsun, and then they'd be unloaded, taken by caravan to Sivas, and then from Sivas they'd make their way into Harput. And as again mentioned earlier, the cameleers and the muleteers were Kurds. This page also gives a couple of shots. The one in the center shows the elaborate gear to dress up the camels, very heavy, and of course, like all camels, usually ill-mannered and bad disposition. This is tape 2. We've finished the first one from the McDaniels Photographic Album at Oberlin College Archives in Oberlin, Ohio. Today is Friday, the 22nd of June, 2007. This page is labeled on the lower left, Harpoot, Harpoot. It shows a number of fairly pathetic scenes of refugees and people who are in really great distress. A couple of the pictures are well known because they appear in the Armenian version of the Maria Jacobson diaries. This particular picture here showing two young boys. This particular one showing a mother and a child, a daughter. This here is similarly a young boy. He's in rags, basically. Some older women who are emaciated, skin and bones, with a relief worker, an Armenian in this case, on the left-hand side. These are old women. This is a picture that I've always thought might possibly be a Kurdish woman or an Armenian lady dressed as a Kurd, probably a Kurd woman though, because of the headdress, fairly characteristic. This image here more than likely represents a crowd of orphans that were assembled for a celebration of Armenian Christmas on January 6th, 1920. All of these kids were given a small little handkerchief of chickpeas roasted with some, with some raisins, sort of a nice mixture. This particular picture here is one of either mothers or maidens with little babies. And in this period, it was difficult to tell whether or not these were pure Armenians, as it were, the offspring of an Armenian father and Armenian mother, or possibly the issue from a rape where many of the Armenian women and girls were raped and gave birth to half Turk and half Armenian kids, something that people don't want to talk about these days, certainly not in Turkey. These represent some pictures from various sorts. They're not well labeled. Some of these are labeled WT, however, and that stands for the wheat trip. Laurence McDaniels made a trip with a couple of helpers going out to seek wheat during the winter. In fact, he was out of Harpoot at the time the Christmas celebrations were going on. On the road, various and sundry scenes wherever he had gone. Garabed was with him, and in fact, here's a picture of Garabed in the bottom center. This particular image is a Kurdish chief and his assistant or right-hand man. And the thing that's significant here is that this Kurdish chief apparently had boasted of his role in some of the massacres of Armenians. And Dr. McDaniels mentions that he looked like a fairly normal guy. And here he was responsible for a lot of atrocities. Here's some loading of the wheat sacks onto the pack mules that they had taken along with them. And as I mentioned earlier, you note that the smaller dimension pictures are taken with Dr. McDaniels' camera. Here's some more. Again, not very well labeled, other than to say that these are from the WT or the wheat trip. We've scanned these, or at least many of them, if not all. There's a picture here of carding cotton using the old-fashioned bow technique. Very ancient method, but it was used, and I believe it's even still used in some primitive areas. Now these represent abandoned German trucks. When Turkey left World War I and agreed to surrender, the Germans took flight and abandoned all kinds of vehicles and left the area post haste. These represent a number of German trucks, etc., that were abandoned and were encountered on the wheat trip. Now, this is where some of the problem comes in. WT, we said, was a wheat trip, and you notice that these are the larger size prints, whereas most of the wheat trip is done with the smaller. He may have taken both cameras. I can't come up with any other excuse or explanation for the presence of these two sizes, whereas most of the others with the smaller dimension are by McDaniels, Laurence, and the larger ones are photographed by his wife. Now here's one that's come off, but this is an interesting one. This page 2. Here's Laurence McDaniels on a horse. This horse happens to have fairly large ears and in fact could easily be mistaken for a mule. But he's called L.H. McDaniels Effendi, Effendi being a title of respect, meaning Mr. So they're saying here he is during that wheat trip. And there's a picture of Garabed with the pack mules laden with some wheat. The Turkish government did in fact supposedly put aside stores of wheat to be used in emergency times. And if one was lucky, one could gain access to this. More often than not, one didn't have access and had to kind of pay bribes, etc., etc. And it sounds good on paper to say that, oh yes, we have reserve wheat supplies, but then the distribution of it was something that they had total control over. But here we are, and you can see the area is covered with snow because this was in fact that winter period. Now here's Christmas 1919. Christmas being a little bit confusing here in that it's in fact January 1919, Armenian Christmas according to the old Julian calendar, whereas Westerners like Americans went by the old the Gregorian papal calendar. These pictures represent a Christmas celebration that they tried to put on for the orphans. And remember the moment earlier I showed you a number of faces. Well, here's yet another one where all of these kids, varying ages. And this is a Christmas tree that they've set up in the area just before the Annie Tracy Riggs Hospital. And this is Henry Harrison Riggs, labeled here as Henry Riggs. They called him Harry. And we heard that from his nephew, Loren Riggs. So I was confused for a while about Henry Harrison Riggs, or some people called him Henry, but close people called him Harry. Here he is dressed up as Santa Claus. And there's a Christmas card here, pulling Santa. Here he is here, but the oxen have in fact been used to pull the affair. And here's the Christmas tree, another view of those attending the cellar. Now we have seen pictures similar to this at the Smith College archives. So we don't know who took these, but it certainly wasn't Frances and it wasn't Laurence. In fact, Frances mentions that she wishes she could have taken pictures of the Christmas, but somehow someone must have given them to her. Now this page with 3 larger pictures shows some of the laying in of stores, as it were, for winter. And of course the staple was wheat, and making bulgur or bulgar or parboiled wheat was a big deal. And these very large kettles called khazans were in fact used to boil wheat, parboil it, and then it would be spread out to dry, and then it would be cracked. And of course pilafs were very common to the Armenians and the Turks, but it's even been popularized in this country as kind of a gourmet food. It was the staple at that time and considered a poor man's dish. Here we have an Armenian couple, an old couple with some pretty tired looking donkeys, and the kids are perched up, in this instance, on the wall taking in the sights. Next page gives some idea of the activities. The one on the lower right is particularly amusing because it's called the Laos Hunt. No, now they're talking now. Okay, now this page shows a number of diverse images. One on the lower right is particularly interesting in that it's got a caption of Laos Hunt, and it's got kids lined up, each examining the hair of the one in front of them to pull out lice. Of course, lice were rampant, and the hair had to be gone through carefully. There's some American, presumably American supervisor here. It seems that plus this one here called swimming pool Gülcük style. Now Gülcük is Lake Gülcük, renamed many years now Lake Hazar in Turkey, south of Harput, where some horrible atrocities occurred and murder of thousands of Armenians, but also was a site where missionaries and consuls and others would spend the hot summer months vacationing by the lake. So here these kids are in kind of a homemade swimming pool. By the time the McDaniels got there, Lake Gülcük was not used as a recreational area. The reasons for that are manifold. First of all, they didn't have the time, they were pretty busy. Secondly, there are large numbers of skeletons, I believe, in that whole vicinity. Whether or not they'd been cleaned up or not is another matter, but in any case, they did not spend time there. In fact, even Leslie Davis, the consul during the genocide, complained that he had had no time to take a break and go down to the lake other than to examine it to see the bodies that he had been told about. Here are some women, young girls, Armenians that are in the care of the relief workers. They seem to be doing something with these handkerchiefs, or they're tearing sheets, but I think it's important to just add quickly here that a lot of these people were taken into Turkish or Kurdish homes as slave labor or harem wives or girlfriends or concubines and what all. And later they either tried to escape or they were kicked out or whatever. But that's where these people came from. Some people have complained, as it were, that the Armenian genocide was not an attempt to kill every last Armenian. Well, neither was the Jewish Holocaust an attempt to kill every last Jew. Some slipped through. These are good examples of who slipped through. Now here's an example of a family of a Turkish kavas named Ahmed, who was very well thought of. And Ahmed's family, his wife, a couple of kids there, they look like nice kids. There's three of them, I think 2 or 3, with some onlookers that have been photographed. The other pictures here just represent maidigs with little babies. And again, as I mentioned earlier, they may be all Armenian or they may be half Armenian. Probably half. Again, people have not wanted to go into detail on this. Now here, we have some additional pictures. The lower left shows some laying in of stores again, preparing things. I've seen a picture very similar to this when we examined pictures at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. There's some film footage taken during the visit of the Harbord Commission, which was, pardon me, after the genocide, when there was some consideration that America would take a mandate for Armenia or Turkey or both. But there they are, things drying in the sun. And the other smaller ones are various people, some of them identified, others not identified. But here's something, a scene here at the wood market again, taking poles on the side of donkeys or mules. These young fellows here in the upper right are some Armenian boys that actually worked for the mission, and they have been described in a little bit of detail. Now, these, for me, are favorites of the album, because these are some really cute kids. And the fun thing about them is that they seem completely taken by all of this stuff. Here, this is a Meidig with the orphan family, as it were. She's got the care of all of these. This here is Bill and his friends. Now, exactly who Bill is, I'm not sure. But there's some really sweetheart kids here. One of them's kind of almost crying. But these two down here, these are kindergarten, and this is a slightly older school. And there's clearly, that looks as though this picture is taken by someone who's standing on a stool or a table and looking down. And the kids here are looking up, this one in particular. You can see them all with their attention up there. This is the teacher. I don't know who was teaching at that time. And this is the same woman who was running the school here. These are slightly older kids. Interestingly enough, they said that while the kids were terrifically traumatized, the youngest ones more or less got over their trauma much more readily than the slightly older ones, and I presume that's because they didn't have the memory that the older ones did in terms of putting everything together. This is Nurse Styley. You can't see her too well, but I think she came from Syracuse. And she was very, very concerned with these orphans, especially the half-orphans, as it were, or the half-Turk, half-Armenian. Here's Miss Styley there again. And here she is here, called the Milk Station Children. Now, when they didn't run a full-fledged operation, but because they did practice triage, the worst cases were taken into the orphanages. They did offer some support, either for older women, as we saw, in terms of a few pennies to help them buy food or give them work, or in this case, they ran a milk station and gave them milk. Now, here are some scabies patients. Remember that business of Favis that I mentioned, where their heads had to be... Now we're starting this page over again. This is a nurse from the United States named Miss Styley. I think she came from Syracuse. But she was apparently quite dedicated to these young babies that were born of Armenian and Turk or Kurd parentage. And she was quite determined to make sure that these kids were looked after, whereas most people were tempted to ignore them. The Armenian women certainly didn't feel very happy about having been raped and now having had a child. But in any case, she did a terrific job. Apparently she was a lovely woman. Here she is down here teaching the young mothers how to take care of kids and so forth. And here she is here at the milk station. Now, when orphans weren't taken into the orphanages, they couldn't take in everyone, and therefore they had to do what you might call a triage. They did help them nevertheless wherever they could, and sometimes they gave milk or else a few coins to buy some food or try to put them to work or whatever. So that's what the milk station is. In this case here, we have some patients described as scabies patients. This is the condition called Favis that we mentioned, where you've got this horrible condition. The hair was shaved off and treated with sulfur, and in any case, they seem to be fairly cheerful. Part of the treatment also was that with the sulfur ointment that they'd use is to sometimes put a little kerchief type thing, knapsack as it were, on the head. So some have that and others don't. Now this page shows some young women. The caption is ex-Turkish bribes. You recall I mentioned a short while ago that these were girls that were taken in for whatever reason, by Turks or Kurds, and then escaped or were given up. When food became very scarce, they were frequently chucked out. Some of them deliberately ran away whenever they could. Here they are being taught to do various and sundry skills. Here we have the manufacture of wool thread. Now, just to add another dimension here, you can't be sure if these young women are being hired to do such work or whether they're inmates, if you can call it that, of the orphanage type facility. They may have been hired, because they actually paid some of these people absolute minimum wage, just a few pennies as it were, to provide wool, which would be then woven into cloth that would be used for people who were without clothes, i.e. everybody. This here, some of the older women, this is the spinning shop where a woman is shown doing spinning. And here, lace is being taught. Of course, a lot of these girls were exposed to lace making. It was not an uncommon thing. Armenian needle lace was commonplace. But if the girls' mothers weren't around, then they may not have learned it the way they should have. So they did have classes. Earlier, these laces used to be sold as part of fundraisers. They used to be shipped off and sold in the Near East relief shops. But at this point, I'm not sure what they were used for. This is a little bit early for that. Here's the boys now, or the males, carpenter shop here on the left, and the shoe shop. And since there's a little bit of activity here, and camera lenses being what they were at that time, you don't have the sharpest focus. In fact, there's a little bit of movement here, especially on the shoe shop here, where people have moved. But they taught them trades. Self-sufficiency was absolutely the most important thing. Now here we have some pictures. This one here on the upper left is called On the Road, but it's really the trip out. Having served their term, the McDaniels decided that they weren't going to sign up for yet another year of service. There are complicated reasons for that, but they didn't. And therefore, they made their way out, and they went out via the northern route, as it would be called, and they went to Sivas. And from Sivas, they went to the port of, on the Black Sea, Samsun. So this shows some of that. So you've got the party stopped in their vehicles. This here is an inn, or khan. Here's another view of the trucks all laden. This is probably a Kurdish home, and you can see it's basically an adobe mud hut using tree trunks as support beams, etc. Pretty primitive. And of course, as I told you, these khans were horribly infested with lice. That wasn't just during the war and post-war. They were routinely. They were described by many as being just sort of monuments to filth, as I would put it. Now here's some pictures of Sivas. They're not labeled, but I know them because of the commonality of the scenes. This is one of the monastery churches that was used as a relief place, and in fact our friend Araxi Hubbard Palmer was a little baby in this immediate vicinity. And the woman who brought her to the United States, Ms. Hubbard, was one of the Hubbards of Sivas, and they operated out of that area. This is the very early Muslim things. And this here is interesting because I don't know where it was taken. Again, it's called Trip Out. It looks to me like an Assyrian church altar. It's called here Hittite ruins. It's absolutely not a Hittite ruin. Whatever it is, it's not. But it looks like an Assyrian church, or else it could be Greek, because that route up north would have had a lot of Greeks in it. The Greeks of the Pontus area bordering on the Black Sea were also uprooted and deported during the Kemalist nationalist period, but that really came to a full peak after the McDaniels left, but it was right on the tail. Now here are some various and sundry things that they did on the way out. This is called Picnic on the Black Sea. They're having sort of fun wading in the water. Again, the smaller dimension format suggests that Mrs. McDaniel took these. There's a Kurdish woman here with her child being carried. Notice that headdress that I referred to. We saw something very similar to it earlier. Now, here's another interesting picture. This is labeled TO, means trip out, but at the same time it's labeled on the lower left, arrival at Harput. There's no doubt that that is on the way out. They describe everyone there showed up to see them out and so forth. The people look pretty good. If these were on the way in, these people would have looked destitute, absolutely in horrible shape. Here they've at least had some benefit of the Near East relief activities, and that, I think it's just a matter of having labeled them properly initially and then having gone through the album perhaps at a later date. They not seeing the TO, they just decided to write. So you have to be very careful, and we have attempted to be very careful in attributing pictures, and if we didn't know, we didn't know, but we've taken a lot of trouble to identify, if possible, what was what and who was who and where it might have been taken. There are a number of signposts that we could have used. This page similarly shows the trip out. And this particular one here, trip out number 15, taken by, it looks like Mrs. McDaniels. Human bones is what it's labeled. They may have sort of established that when it was taken and just remembered it. But the entire countryside, of course, was strewn with bones due to massacres, murders, deaths, eaten by dogs, wild animals, jackals, etc. Now, this page here shows further little sightseeing on the way out, and this represents the area of Amasya, a city that was of mixed population. The Armenians were a minority there, but an important minority. Had Turks and Greeks. It was an old city and quite beautifully situated, and it's famous historically because the rock tombs which you see in this right-hand picture, supposedly Mithridates of antiquity, had these rocks hewn, etc. So it's kind of an important area historically, and there's a lot of steep steps dug out in the mountainside going up into these tombs. Pretty steep and rugged area. I certainly wouldn't want to do it myself. I hate heights. Now, this particular batch deals with having reached Constantinople. There's Robert College, which is frequently mistakenly labeled Robert's College. It's not, it's Robert, R-O-B-E-R-T, Robert College, the first of the many Protestant American colleges established in Turkey. But scenes of the Bosphorus, etc., and we haven't done anything on these because these are too well known. So you can see here that we haven't lifted these things out. This is the original album, and they went, nevertheless, on the grand tour on their way home, including places like Egypt, where you can see here the Great Pyramid behind them, riding a camel, etc. So they did a little bit of sightseeing before they left the area and came back to New York and he started work again soon after at Cornell University in the Department of Botany. He had done his PhD there under a professor that he got along with very, very well, Arthur Johnson Eames, who was his mentor and with whom Dr. McDaniels wrote the first English language plant anatomy textbook by McGraw-Hill. It's a bit of a classic. It went through several editions and translations for that matter. So we've gone through it. We have a rough idea of what the album's about so far as our immediate interests were. We could have scanned the whole thing, but I don't think that would have, it was too much work because a lot of these images needed an immense amount of work fixing them up. Okay. Lucy Stone, 1818 to 1893. Bronze copy of a bust by Anne Whitney, 1892, given to Oberlin College in honor of Marlene Deal Merrill on the 150th anniversary of the beginning of coeducation, which occurred at Oberlin with the admission of 4 women to the, quote, gentleman's course, end quote, in the fall of 1837. The historic step was hailed by the American Annals of Education in 1838. Quote, the benefits which are likely to flow from it are immense. Woman is to be free. The hour of her emancipation is at hand. Daughters of America, rejoice. One of the early results was the matriculation of Lucy Stone, one of America's most notable women, who was born in 1818 near West Brookfield, Massachusetts, the 8th of 9 brothers and sisters. Even as a child, she resented the assigning of women to an inferior role, and she devoted her life to fighting injustice. She was attracted to the anti-slavery crusade, and in 1843, at the age of 25, she enrolled at Oberlin, where she lived frugally, supported herself through housework and tutoring, and studied Greek and Hebrew, partly to gain the critical tools to refute biblical interpretations supporting arguments for the subjection of women. She had a special talent for public speaking, but was denied an opportunity to read her senior essay at commencements, as was the custom for male graduates. The injustice was corrected 36 years later when she was an honored speaker at Oberlin's semi-centennial jubilee. Better late than never. As a student and later as an alumna, she was an outspoken critic of Oberlin's shortcomings, especially when it failed to stand for equality for blacks and for women. When she graduated in 1847, Stone was the first Massachusetts woman to get a college degree. Almost immediately, she became a lecturer for Garrison's Anti-Slavery Society and proved to be extremely effective. Soon she began to lecture on women's rights, too, providing her own publicity and collecting funds for her expenses. By 1850, she was an acknowledged feminist leader. In that year, she convened the first National Women's Rights Convention at Worcester, Massachusetts, my hometown. In 1855, she and Henry Blackwell were married, but not without publishing a joint protest against the marriage laws which gave the husband control over his wife and her property. She kept her own name rather than take her husband's, one of the first to adopt this means of protest, although an astute observer will see that she acknowledges him with her brooch. We'll see if her brooch a little bit later on shows that. I guess it does. Although she left the lecture circuit to care for her daughter Alice, born 1857, she remained active in other ways. In 1858, for example, she protested taxation of women without representation by allowing some of her household goods to be sold for taxes, an action which attracted wide public attention. After the Civil War, she helped form the American Equal Rights Association, which worked for both black and women's suffrage, and resumed a full lecture schedule as the suffrage movement focused attention on winning enfranchisement state by state. As the leaders divided into factions over strategy and objectives, she, along with Julia Ward Howe and Lloyd Garrison, organized the American Women's Suffrage Association in 1869, which attempted to broaden the 15th Amendment to include enfranchisement of women. She served as chair of the executive board of the AWSA for 20 years and founded and edited its weekly paper, The Woman's Journal, the voice of the woman's movement, characterized by her as, quote, a big baby which never grows up and always has to be fed, end quote. So great were its demands on her. In 1890, the younger members of the suffrage movement decided to bury old antagonisms and unite the NWSA and the AWSA as the National American Woman Suffrage Association, with Lucy Stone as president and Susan B. Anthony as vice president. She gave her last lectures at the World's Columbian Exposition at Chicago in 1893, where the original sculpture by Whitney was on exhibit, and died shortly afterwards at her home in Dorchester, Massachusetts. For further reading, see Carl Lasser and Marlene Merrill, Friends and Sisters, Letters Between Lucy Stone and Antoinette Brown Blackwell, Urbana in Chicago, 1987. Another work is Eleanor Rice Hayes' Morning Star, a biography of Lucy Stone, New York, 1961. And finally, Leslie Wheeler, Loving Warriors, New York, 1981. Now, if we come up here and look, you can see that this does say Lucy Stone B, LSB. That's her brooch that shows the B. That's what they were referring to down there. So on her brooch, it does give the Blackwell.